Well, welcome back to part two of our two-part interview and discussion with Brian Stutzman. Now we'll be discussing prophecies, but because this is part two, and in case someone misses part one, do you want to give like a brief overview of yourself and before we delve into the topic?
Sure, absolutely. Brian Stutzman. I live most of the time in Idaho Falls, Idaho, part-time in Tarpon Springs, Florida, and I'm a businessman and landlord up here in Idaho, and got really interested about 10 years ago, a little bit more than normal, in Illinois and about the mob that killed Joseph Smith, and then became interested in the prophecies that Joseph Smith gave, and that's what I'd like to talk about today.
I believe you have a slideshow, so if you want to like use that as you discuss the topic. But for those who are listening to this episode, in the show notes, I'll include my own work on Joseph Smith's prophecies as well, and the various resources I've gathered from other people as well. So
Yeah. Robert, you've done quite a bit on Joseph Smith's prophecy. So this is a book, the timeline of Joseph Smith's prophecies, prophecies fulfilled. And I think it's really important that when we ever talk about prophecies, we remember 1 Corinthians 14:22, prophesying serveth not for them that believe not, but for them which believe. Yeah, it's not here to convince anybody because, true testimonies that last a long time are really not based upon one or two things. They're based upon study, prayer, you know, reading and studying the scriptures, the Book of Mormon, that type of thing, and a spiritual confirmation. But that being said, the Book of Mormon, keystone of our religion, right? The way that this book that I just showed is set up is we believe, the Book of Mormon is the prophecies of Alma, Nephi, and Mosiah. And the Doctrine and Covenants is the prophecy, actually, statements given by the Lord through Joseph Smith. So there's about 1,100 statements. I think John Widstow came up with the 1,100 forward-looking statements in the Doctrine and Covenants. Well, the book I have today is actually a gentleman by the name of Pat Ament wrote the foundational work and self-published this in 2003. He was actually married to my sister-in-law for a number of years, and he's a great writer and a researcher. Well, a while back, a well-known podcaster, came out bashing the prophecies of Joseph Smith. And I got out Pat's book and hundreds of fulfilled prophecies. So I contacted Pat and I said, Pat, will you republish your book? And he says, well, obviously he's a faithful, strong member of the church. But he says, I'm writing in this other field here and I'm doing some other things. Why don't you just do it? I said, great. We'll publish. No, just use your name. Just send me the profits. I said, the revenue. I said, I'm happy to do that. And so what we put together here is essentially a repeat with some additions and some editing of this original work. And it's the sayings and prophecies, comments written by other people and written by Joseph Smith himself, journal entries and things like this, just a whole bunch of different statements and prophecies. And sometimes it will be, second person experiences like, last year I was over with Joseph Smith and he prophesied that this would happen. Well, we don't know the exact words that Joseph Smith used, but we do know that the person that was there wrote it down, and this is his interpretation of how Joseph Smith did it, said what he said, and then a lot of times I'll put in their comments how they saw the prophecy fulfilled. Heard Joseph Smith do this, and then lo and behold, this happened. So that it would be, first person account of an experience of what they heard and what they wrote down and their perceptions. So again, the role of prophecy should be just a brick in the foundation of a larger foundation, right? Prayer, faith, study, getting a testimony of the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ, reading the scriptures, and then these other works like this book here would be, I would consider it just a small, underlying second layer, third layer type brick in somebody's foundation. Shouldn't be the primary reason they have a testimony or don't have a testimony. So this book I showed the cover of, it's like $14.99 on Amazon. And each chapter, the way it's written is there's an introduction, and then there's the different periods of church history. Nauvoo, well, let's start out Palmyra, Kirtland, Zion's Camp, back to Kirtland, Missouri, Illinois, and then kind of the Martyrdom area period, right? And so what happens is that as we have each chapter, there's a couple pages of what's going on in church history. And then many of the known prophecies, well, lesser known, most people don't know many of these, by the period, normally a date, month, and year, in this sequential order. And then we go to the next part of church history, and there's a write-up, say Kirtland, what's happening there, and with the prophecies that happened there. Okay. So I came out with a new version that was just published this week. It's On This Day, Joseph Smith's Prophecies Fulfilled. We took out all the history, and we also put in what it is. We took out the history of what's going on in each section, but we just put it by day. So if you want to know what Joseph Smith said today, or say September 1, you could go to the book by that day, and it will be what he said on that day, if there's any prophecies that we have a record of, and not necessarily by year. So you might have September 1, 1839, and then next day, September 2nd, 1844. Excuse me, he was dead then. September 43, and then the next page would be September 10th, 1841. So it's by day. And that's a smaller book. It sells for $9.99 on Amazon, but it has a lot of the same material. Any questions?
Any particular prophecies that you may find like worthy to mention in the this particular episode? Because there's a number of them. The book kind of details like a number of prophecies. So any particular ones you think are rather interesting that people should be aware of?
Yeah, let me go through each one. Now, in the back, let me go through each period, or at least a couple of my favorites. In the back of the book, we talk about, how do you interpret prophecy, besides just on the face value, okay? Because we look in the Bible, right? And we one of the most famous Old Testament scriptures is Isaiah, right? And he says that unto us a child will be born, a virgin shall conceive. His name will be called Emmanuel, right? Well, for 699 years, people said Isaiah was a false prophet because it took 700 years for Jesus to be born, right? So you can't take a prophecy and say, well, that guy's a false prophet because it just happened to have not come true yet, such as settling in Independence, Missouri, Jackson County. That will happen. That does not, just because it hasn't happened, or the temple at Far West. There's other times, and we explain this in the back of the book. Say, Jonah was commanded by God to go to Nineveh, and we know the famous story that he didn't go, and he got swallowed by a whale and spit out 3 days later. Well, he went to Nineveh and told them that the city would be destroyed. Well, guess what? The city was not destroyed. And there, in the biblical account, there's no record that he said, it's based upon your righteousness or whatever. But the city repented and it wasn't destroyed. So sometimes prophecies can have hinges on them. They're based upon this. Joseph Smith said somebody to New York and said that city will be destroyed if they didn't accept the gospel. And there was hundreds of converts, even a temple in New York City today. So, if then, those types of things. We talk about it in the last chapter, 2 chapters of the book. So to get to your question directly, let's talk about Palmyra. Many great things happened in Palmyra that was just really showed Joseph Smith's prophetic gift that Jesus Christ gave through the restoration, his prophet of the restoration, just a great prophetic gift. I really like this one in summer of 1829. The persecution was just huge. People got together in Palmyra and banded together. They heard that Joseph Smith was going to be publishing this new book of scripture. They banded together and pledged that they would not buy it. How would you like that reception from your neighbors? Further, they pledged that they were going to kill Joseph Smith. There's this Dr. McIntyre who decided he was well, just let me, as Joseph was about to make arrangements to print the Book of Mormon with E.B. Grannon, to begin the printing of the Book of Mormon, a Dr. McIntyre came in and informed Joseph that 40 men were collected in the capacity of a mob. The mob had requested Dr. McIntyre take command of the company, had refused to do so, and Mr. Huzzy, that's H-U-Z-Z-Y, a hat maker from Palmyra, offered his services. Their aim was to kill Joseph Smith. On hearing this, Joseph's mother besought him not to go. He smiled at her fears, saying, "Never mind, mother, just put your trust in God, and nothing will hurt me today." Is that a prophetic statement? It could be. In a short time, he set out for Palmyra. If you've been at the Smith home, you kind of go north toward Palmyra. Along this route, he found the mob seated on a fence running along the road. Coming to Mr. Huzzy first, Joseph took off his hat and good-naturedly said, "Good morning, Mr. Huzzy." Joseph passed on to the next man, whom he saluted in like manner, and the next, and so on. This struck them with confusion, and while they were pondering in amazement, Joseph passed on, leaving them perched upon the fence like so many, as Lucy Mack Smith uses this term, like so many roosting chickens. And Joseph arrived at Palmyra without being molested, without being killed. Let's move to Kirtland. We all know about the Kirtland Safety Society. Joseph was really concerned about the bank, even though he helped start it, had gone off track. They weren't living righteous principles, and Joseph warned them. And then Joseph even backed out of the bank, the Kirtland Safety Society, and said, "We're doomed. This isn't going to work out. You guys aren't doing this right." A lot agreed. We also know that Kirtland Safety Society was crunched by the national recession of 1837. In fact, about 50% of all financial institutions went bankrupt, went out of business. In New York City alone, financial failures, the loss amounted to over $100 million just in New York City. Well, it crushed Kirtland Safety Society, and some people were really upset. In fact, so much so that they drove Joseph out of the town. Joseph had to leave it in the middle of the night to protect his own family and his life. Well, Joseph, before he left, made a prediction, a prophecy. So, let me just share this with you. Some of the Kirtland bank bills of various denominations, which now became worthless, were preserved by the saints. Joseph prophesied that the Kirtland notes would one day be as good as gold. Years later, with the arrival of the saints in Salt Lake area in 1847, so this is 10 years later, they would need a monetary system. Gold dust brought to Salt Lake by returning members of the Mormon battalion were the gold dust it was inconvenient, difficult to coin. The Kirtland notes thus were brought out, signed again, and placed on par with gold. Thus fulfilling the prophecy of Joseph, said Brigham Young, that the Kirtland notes would one day be as good as gold. Just 10 years after everybody was mad because they weren't worth anything. Are you, Robert, familiar with the prophecy and the experience of Sylvester Smith on Zion's camp? Kind of the next era.
Only based on what I read from the book.
Yeah. Well, the bottom line is Zion's camp was it was a crucible of leadership. People who, as you know, went on to lead the church later a lot of them were in Zion's camp, or I should say just the opposite. A lot of people in Zion's camp went on to be leaders in the church. It was a training ground, and it was difficult. And the bottom line is that people were belly aching, they were complaining, the morale was down, and people were not feeling good, and their animals, their horses, were sick, and they were just sitting around complaining. So this is May 17th, 1834. Joseph got together with them, and there was this Mr. Sylvester Smith, no relation to the prophet. Joseph got everybody and said, basically, they needed to humble themselves before the Lord, and he exhorted them, I'm just reading this, to humble themselves before the Lord, become united, that they may not be scourged. The following day, nearly every horse was sick or lame. The prophet said, for a witness that God overruled and had his eye upon them, all those who would humble themselves before the Lord should know that the hand of God was in this misfortune, and their horses should be restored to health immediately. By 12 o'clock the same day, the horses were all nimble as ever, with the exception of one of Mr. Sylvester Smith's horses, which soon afterward died. Now, honestly, you have this experience, one or two others. Does that make a prophet? Maybe, maybe not. But when you get dozens, when you get 50, when you get 100, you better start paying attention. And the people of the church in Joseph's time were very much aware of all this that was happening, and just grew their testimony this way. It was just a phenomenal experience to be around the prophet and see him give prophecies and utterances outside of the scriptures. So one of my other favorites was in the Missouri era. We know that Joseph was and Hiram and others, Alexander McRae and others, were in Liberty Jail, right? And while Joseph was in Liberty Jail, most members of the church are familiar that he had an attorney named Alexander Donovan. And there's quite a story about he disobeyed an illegal order to kill Joseph. But Donovan was acting as an attorney and came and was visiting Liberty Jail. And what happened was that he was talking upstairs about doing legal work for some other person, and said he was going to get payment for his legal work by some land in Jackson County, a house or whatever. And Joseph heard this and said, quote, I advise you not to take Jackson County land in payment of the debt. God's wrath hangs over Jackson County. God's people have been ruthlessly driven from it, and you will live to see the day when it will be visited by fire and sword. The Lord of hosts will sweep it with the bosom of destruction. The fields and farms and houses will be destroyed, and only the chimneys will be left to mark the desolation. Well, sadly, most people don't remember this, but the Civil War is a fulfillment of this prophecy, because there was tremendous destruction brought by Quantrell's raiders. In fact, Jackson County, that area of Missouri, was like the second bloodiest part of the Civil War. And they came through Jackson County, Cass and Bates counties, killing animals, burning homes and fields, and molesting the inhabitants. Whole areas were plundered, left desolate by fire and sword, and some depopulated. The sufferings of the Missouri people have been thought by many writers to have exceeded the sufferings of the Mormons. Somebody wrote in 1864 about the Civil War, we found houses, barns, outbuildings, they all burned down and had nothing left standing but the chimneys. This is a writer named A. Saxey in 1864. So it came completely as Joseph Smith prophesied. Let's talk about the Nauvoo era. Most people know Porter Rockwell. Most people know the story that he was accused of shooting at Governor Boggs. Porter Rockwell was arrested March 4th, 1843 in St. Louis. He was put in shackles and taken to Independence. On March 15th, so 11 days later, Joseph spoke of Rockwell's fate. He said, quote, I prophesied in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ that Orrin Porter Rockwell would get away honorably from the Missourians. This is in History of the Church. Rockwell was tried 9 months later, December 13th, 1843, and the charge of shooting former Governor Boggs could not be sustained, and Rockwell was released. Let me end with the last prophecy that Joseph Smith actually gave to a person. This was the night before the martyrdom. He gave two more prophecies, but they were just kind of general, like the rise of the church and things on June 27th. The last prophecy he gave to a person was to Dan Jones, the night of June 26, 1844, in the bedroom upstairs at Carthage Jail. Dan Jones had received his mission call to go to Wales. He was unsure if he would be able to go because they were upstairs in the Carthage Jail, and there was rustling around outside. They heard gunshots. Joseph had repeatedly prophesied. In fact, he prophesied earlier. Heber C. Kimball's son, William Kimball, wrote that he was in 1843. He and about 25 people were together, and Joseph prophesied of Joseph's death, and Brigham Young would take over, and several things that Brigham Young would accomplish. And William Kimball later wrote this and said, everything Joseph said Brigham would do has come to pass. So Joseph was in the jail, and he knew upstairs in the bedroom, he knew that the time was short. He knew that a mob was going to kill him. He never said that John Taylor, Willard Richards was going to take his life, because they didn't, because as I said in the other podcast, Joseph was very much alive. He fell out of the window and he was shot by a mob by the well. That's who killed Joseph Smith, was a mob by the well. But he knew that the time was short, and he sat there and was talking to Dan Jones about death, and he asked Dan if he was ready to die, or Dan asked the prophet if he was ready to die, and he said, he was prepared. And then Joseph looked over at Dan Jones and said, you're not going to die. He says, ye shall yet see Wales and fulfill the mission appointed to you. Well, the next day, June 27th, Joseph decides that he needs to have his attorney in Quincy come up. And so he sends Dan with some papers, and Dan's running some errands. He comes back to jail, gets on his horse. He has some papers, and the mob thinks that the papers were to call the Nauvoo Legion, which had been disbanded, but organize them and come and get Joseph out of the Carthage jail. So the mob didn't want that, and they start shooting at Dan Jones from a very short distance, and they miraculously, all the bullets missed him. It did turn Dan Jones' horse around, and they went down the wrong road to Quincy. And that becomes important because there was some mob people on the road to Quincy with orders to kill Dan Jones if he came that way. So 2 times Dan Jones' life was spared. And then later that day, he was taking a riverboat to Quincy, and he came through Warsaw, and the boat was stopped at Warsaw, and some mob people, or anti-Mormons, searched the boat looking for any suspicious characters, any Mormons, whatever. They completely missed Dan Jones. They didn't even see him, even though he was right there on the boat, that small boat. That's all that was on the river back then. And and Dan made it to Quincy. So 3 times his life was threatened, or he could have been killed the day of the martyrdom. And Joseph Smith's prophecy came true, that he was not only spared 3 times, but he did go on to not only go on 1 mission to Wales, but go on to 2 missions to Wales. He wrote prophetically. Dan Jones wrote tremendously, is the word I was looking for. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of gospel tracts, and he was a tremendous missionary. In fact, if you look at Preach My Gospel, even the new edition, lesson 1, page 1, has a painting of Dan Jones, and that same painting is in the Provo MTC as you walk in. Great missionary, Dan Jones, preaching, brought in thousands of people to the church, right? And this is kind of an interesting tidbit. He brought some Welsh, he went to Wales, obviously, and he brought some people back that were really great singers. And when they brought him to Salt Lake, and when the church was having a conference, they needed a choir, and they selected Dan Jones's converts to be the first choir, or the main choir there, and at the conference. And the basis of Dan Jones's Welsh choir became the basis of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, now known as the choir at Temple Square. All because of Dan Jones, and all because, in my opinion, Joseph Smith's last prophecy to a person that he will live and yet see Wells. And now we have the Mormon Tabernacle Choir and tens of thousands of converts because of Dan Jones. Phenomenal missionary and fulfillment of Dan Jones's missionary work and Joseph's prophecies. So that's kind of the book in a nutshell, some different eras of prophecies. And it's all credit back to Pat Ament for putting this together and giving me written permission to promote it and publish it, because we want to get the word out there that Joseph Smith gave hundreds of prophecies. Robert, any comments?
No, I think that's a good overview. Like, for those who are interested in, like, say, Dan Jones, Ron Walker, who used to be with BYU, he's translated like a ton of Welsh Latter-day Saint periodicals and articles, including any number of volumes of Zion's Trumpet when Dan Jones was actually editor, and there's a lot of gems theologically and historically in those volumes. But I think that's a good overview because, like, as you know, like, it's something I've been doing a lot of work on, but I think Pat's book, and I'm glad it was reprinted, is probably the best book in the market. There's been a few others, like Nephi Morris's one, but that came out 100 years ago. It's dated. Drain Crowther, but it's kind of hit and miss. He kind of tends to, like, give a lot of weight to, like, say, hearsay accounts and later accounts. At least with this particular volume, a lot of it's more like contemporary and more closer to primary source material at times. So that's something I do appreciate. But no, that's a good overview. And as I said, on the show notes, alongside your book on Warsaw, I'll include a link to the most recent edition of Joseph Smith's Prophecies volume as well in the show notes. So hopefully people will actually track it down and read it, because it is a very good volume. So
appreciate it. People need to know Joseph Smith had a great prophetic gift, and as the scripture first said that I shared, if you have faith and believe, why this will be something that can help strengthen your testimony.
Yeah, and I also do appreciate, like, in both volumes, there's always been, like, a editions, I should say. There's always been a discussion about the contingent or conditional nature of prophecy as well. That's usually, like, overlooked by both critic and apologist alike, but that's pretty important as well.
Yep. All right, thank you.
No, my pleasure. And as I said, like, hopefully people will track down the books and study them and have a better appreciation, like, say, Warsaw, Illinois, the Martyrdom, as well as Joseph Smith's prophetic gifts. But Brian, thanks for coming on the 2 parts of for 2 episodes today.
Okay, it's good to be with you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too.